Ah, yes, war. I just finished watching the Ken Burns documentary about the Vietnam War. I don't want to spoil anything, but that one did not go too well for anybody. The documentary features this guy, a really brilliant former North Vietnamese soldier, who poignantly caps off the introduction to the film by saying, "People sing about victory, about liberation. They're wrong. Who won and who lost is not a question. In war, no one wins or loses. There's only destruction. Only those who never fought like to argue about who won and who lost." Indeed. So why do we not only fight so many real wars, but we like to constantly declare wars on things that you can't actually make war on? Here's our governor, Mike DeWine, just a couple of weeks ago.
We are certainly at war. I don't know any other way to describe this but to say that we are at war.
In the 1960s, it was President Lyndon Johnson.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
A war that was ultimately bankrupted by the real war in Vietnam. In the early 2000s, there was George W. Bush.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
And of course, various leaders at various times have declared war on drugs. Now, it's commonly argued that Richard Nixon was the first to officially do that. I could nitpick that, and I will later, but let's start there.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Later, there were similar declarations from Reagan.
Success of the South Florida Task Force, and because of increasing organized crime involvement in drug abuse, we will establish 12 additional task forces in key areas in the United States. I believe that these task forces will allow us to mount an intensive and coordinated campaign against international and domestic drug trafficking and other organized criminal enterprises.
George H.W. Bush.
But the war on drugs will be hard won, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, child by child. If we fight this war as a divided nation, then the war is lost.
Clinton.
But we know we must do more because the drug cartels will do more. After all, there's a lot of money in this. So we're already deploying new technologies, increasing the customs budget, doubling the number of Border Patrol agents along the southwest border. And today I'm committing another $73 million to the Defense Department's $800 million counter-narcotics budget to help support the interdiction efforts in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Barack Obama actually tried to stop using the war analogy, though plenty of the old drug warring, especially abroad, continued.
So we are continuing to speed up the delivery of equipment and training that our Mexican partners need to keep up this fight. As President Calderon cracks down on money laundering in Mexico, we're putting unprecedented pressure on cartels and their finances here in the United States.
And Trump.
Whether we are going to end the scourge of drug addiction in America, we are going to end it, or we are going to at least make an extremely big dent in this terrible, terrible problem. Over the last year, we have mobilized the entire federal government to address this crisis. We have secured $6 billion in new funding to combat opioids, the most money ever received in history.
So why declare war on stuff that can't fight back? Well, in some ways it's pretty simple. Governor DeWine explained it pretty well this weekend.
In a time of war, we have to make sacrifices. And I certainly, in the last week or so, have asked the people of Ohio to make many sacrifices.
DeWine is doing a super job taking this seriously. Let's give him some credit. But how did he get elected with those speeches? My God, where is Abraham Lincoln when you need him? There he is, and just in time. Because I was about to say that governments also declare war because war justifies both unusual expenditures and expansions of federal power. One of the most famous cases in this country is when President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, meaning the government could detain people indefinitely without explaining why. During the Second World War, Japanese Americans were rounded up and put in internment camps. During the War on Terror, indefinite detention and torture were widely practiced, and arguments in their favor were made by high government officials. Were they high? No, I don't mean high like that, though maybe they were. Anyway, today the Justice Department has apparently sought permission from Congress to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in the face of the COVID-19 epidemic. In short, war justifies the violation of otherwise sacrosanct principles. That's a good line. Let's repeat it together. War justifies the violation of otherwise sacrosanct principles. There are many other examples, from the firebombing of Dresden, to the use of the atomic bomb in Japan, to the carpet bombing of North Vietnam. Okay, fine, but why drugs? I mean, if I wanted to, I could go back to Michigan today and walk into a store, and I could get something called Big Gas Slimer Cookie Live Resin, or Live Resin. It's like that next lives here, lives here, that always messes me up. And I can also get that in tangy and kosher varieties. So Big Gas Tangy Kosher Cookie Live or Live Resin. I don't know. I mean, pardon my French, but what the fuck is Big Gas Slimer Cookie Live Resin? And do I want big gas? And do I need it kosher? Okay, it's true. After wars, we often make up with our enemies. I mean, the Germans are our buddies now, after all, not to mention the South. But it's a little weird to declare war on drugs when the place down the street from me has a big sign that says drugs, because what they sell are, well, drugs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the ironies in all this. Probably half of you are jacked up on Adderall right now. Adderall is just speed, or amphetamine. But since your doctor gave it to you, it's medicinal. When the Nazis took speed to improve their performance during the Blitzkrieg, it was a performance-enhancing drug. Same for when John F. Kennedy was injected with it. But when I take speed to add a little bit of edge to my weekend, I'm suddenly a target of the war on drugs. Weird, huh? I suppose this is the part where we try to get some historical perspective? Yes, exactly. This is where historical perspective comes in handy. I'd also like to apologize for Monk. He's a little punchy today. He was up late last night on the internet. Anyway, this is where I start to explain why dating the war on drugs, just Richard Nixon's famous speech,
Public enemy number one.
really misses the mark. To understand why the United States and other countries have declared war on drugs, we've got to go back. And I mean way back. Actually, we could go way back if we wanted, to like mushroom-eating Neolithic people. But we won't quite have time for all that. So let's just go back some of the way. 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This is a pretty big date. 1492 is the beginning of truly global history because, though Columbus wasn't the first guy to connect the old and new worlds, that was this guy, about 500 years earlier, when Columbus did it, the connection stuck, and the old and new worlds began to interact. At first, there was just a trickle of interaction, but that trickle gradually grew into massive, teeming global networks. There are various names for this: the Columbian Exchange, globalization, or as one student of mine once put it, some fucked up shit, brah. That last one's a little vague, but you get the idea. And this growing interaction led to the spread of intoxicants around the world, from places that they might have existed for millennia to places where they'd never been seen before. From opium and cannabis to distilled spirits, tobacco, coffee, tea, and so forth. According to historian David Courtwright, this was the beginning of what we should call the psychoactive revolution, whereby, as he puts it, people all over the world gradually acquired more and more potent means of altering their ordinary waking consciousness. Indeed, the desire for psychoactive goods played a major role in inspiring more trade between different parts of the world. But for our story, the really crucial shift occurred at the end of the 18th century. This was a period that saw various significant political revolutions, the beginnings of an industrial revolution, and all of this having been inspired in part by an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment that championed new ways of thinking and doing things. In particular, Enlightenment thinkers pushed the idea that science and rationality should govern decision-making rather than religious faith, that people should be free to live their lives as they saw fit, that governments should be based on legal constitutions and their power should be relatively limited, and that people should be able to move around and engage in commerce and other activities freely without significant interference from government. Eventually, these core ideas would be considered central to what people today refer to as Western-style liberalism, not to be confused with liberals who live in California, a mistake our president, a self-proclaimed genius, recently made. No, Western-style liberalism are the ideas that gave birth to this here very country. Small, limited government, democracy, separation of church and state, the free pursuit of life, liberty, happiness, etc. These were quite revolutionary changes in the history of the world, and while more traditional belief in monarchy or authoritarian government, religious belief over science, and so forth didn't go easily and have not left us, these changes were revolutionary and radically altered the world, and thus we usually say that this period inaugurated the truly modern era. Not to be confused with the period before that, starting in about 1492, which is usually called the early modern era. So these are big changes, huge, and they end up creating the modern world. They also have two huge consequences for our story. First, they end up creating the drug problem, and second, they end up creating the conditions that make the suppression of the so-called drug problem almost impossible. What do I mean by this? Well, let's start with the making of an apparent drug problem. The modern era brings about a radical alteration in the way people experience the world. Thanks to new technologies like the steam engine, people can move from place to place in the blink of an eye in comparison to earlier eras. Thanks eventually to electric light, suddenly business can be done all night long. Factories can stay open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The pace of work itself speeds up and movement of peoples and goods accelerates to an extraordinary degree, as people move out of the countryside and into the cities and across the oceans. This creates a whole new field to life in the modern era. It's a very anxious feeling in comparison to that of earlier eras. We sometimes simply call this feeling modernity. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels probably summed up that feeling better than anyone else. Here's how they described it. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch, i.e. modernity, from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. Now that is a stunningly accurate description of this period and how it felt to live in it. So people's lives have been radically changed and disrupted. They are working long hours at an intense pace, and they have lost a lot of security that they once had in their small rural village. They are suddenly living in close quarters with people who look, talk, and worship differently than them. In short, it's a disorienting and stressful time. This leads to a lot of heavy drinking in the United States and in other countries. And that heavy drinking is complemented by the use of more novel kinds of drugs that are, once again, products of these changes in the modern world. Science helps to isolate the active ingredients in drugs, like the morphine in opium or the cocaine in coca, and suddenly medicine is revolutionized. With morphine, doctors can suddenly kill pain really easily. But people can also use morphine to get high really easily, and, somewhat more problematically, to kill themselves faster and more readily than ever. This is a big part of what Courtwright is referring to when he talks about the psychoactive revolution. More and faster ways to get intoxicated lead to new forms of drug use and abuse. And all of this gets caught up with other new developments of the modern era, like slick, deceptive mass marketing to consumers. Most troubling along these lines are the development and marketing of so-called patent medicines, secret remedies that, in the United States, you could claim did anything you wanted. There were no restrictions. Again, this is the freedom of classic liberalism. Probably most notorious among these were so-called soothing syrups. So say you've got a colicky baby, and it's driving you bananas because he's screaming all the time and you can't sleep and so on and so forth. Well, you might find the marketing of one of these soothing syrups with their guaranteed to work secret recipe very attractive. Just a couple of teaspoons and little Pepito is sleeping like a champ. Works like a charm. The only problem is that after a few weeks of Pepito getting his soothing syrup every night, you run out, and then you find out that Pepito gets really ornery without his special soothing syrup. Why? Because it turns out that the main ingredient in the soothing syrup was morphine, and now your baby is a junkie. Or perhaps even worse, Pepito ODs and dies. But you probably never find out why, because the patent medicine manufacturer is free to put whatever they want in their soothing syrups and claim it does everything from cure diarrhea to perform miracles, and you can't do anything about it because there's nothing to stop them. This was the late 19th century, and it was the apex of free market, deregulated liberal capitalism. And however much I might put scare quotes on the drug problem, people like Courtwright are correct when they emphasize that there were some real problems with this very unregulated system. On top of this, there were other things about drugs that concerned people. Drugs often came from foreign lands and were associated with foreign people. Opium, for example, was overwhelmingly associated with despised Chinese immigrants. Cannabis was associated with the so-called Orient in general, and later with Mexican immigrants, and then a bit later black jazz musicians, all of which helped give it a sinister reputation among mainstream Americans, i.e. white people. Drinking was associated with Catholic immigrants like the Germans here in Cincinnati. You ever been to Bachfest downtown? It's quite a spectacle.
We are in the presence of royalty. Good morning, Jacqueline. So we've got Jacqueline Cox, the reigning sausage queen.
Furthermore, there were a lot of people in the United States at the time who thought the U.S. was a white Protestant country, period. There's still some people who think that. In any case, they thought these other people were a threat. This was also a period that saw the rise of new, supposedly scientific ideas like social Darwinism or so-called degeneration theory that suggested that sick people or unfit people or drunks or drug addicts could pass on their bad traits to the next generation. And this would degenerate the overall quality of the nation, weakening it in the face of enemies. Indeed, drug use was often portrayed as a kind of social contagion. So all of this was supposedly weakening the whole country from within. On top of that, drug users seemed to lose their free will. And free will is a fundamental requirement of a free democratic society. People must be able to freely abide by the laws of the land. And there were actually a couple of other big factors related to China and the Philippines and other stuff, but there's only so much I can cram into one video, so we'll leave that aside for the moment.